Good morning. My name is T. Morris, and I'm an associate professor of African American and African Studies at Ohio State Newark, and I'm the moderator for this session. I would like to thank you all for joining us for this symposium, Forward, Creating Feminist Futures, which honors the centennial of the 19th Amendment that extended women's voting rights, as well as the 20th anniversary of the Women's Place at Ohio State. In this session, we will be discussing promoting equity for women of color, particularly as it relates to political representation and protections under the law. Due to a later rising development, Professor Amna Akbar will be unable to join us today, but I am happy to be joined by two amazing scholars, Dr. Elizabeth Castle and Dr. Christina Bejarano. After a brief introduction of both panelists, we will proceed with a moderated discussion, and then we will have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of for questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. Dr. Beth Castle works at the intersections of media, scholarship, and activism, and as an anti-racist educator, committed to liberating and sharing unknown histories of resistance. She started the Warrior Woman Project to reserve the oral histories of Indigenous activists and disrupt the dominant historical narrative through her book, Women Were the Backbone, Men Were the Jawbone, Native Women's Activism in the Red Power Movement. While completing her PhD at Cambridge University, she worked at the White House for President Clinton's Initiative on Race. She co-directed the Peabody Award-nominated film Warrior Women, which premiered on PBS, and continues the collective work of the Warrior Woman Project in decolonizing curricula, activist archiving, and community media work. Dr. Christina Bejarano is a professor of political science at Texas Women's University and works with their Jane Nelson Institute for Women's Leadership. She is a nationally recognized author, speaker, and advisor on Latina electoral politics in the US. Dr. Bejarano has 2 books on Latina politics, one on political candidates, The Latina Advantage, Gender, Race, and Political Success, and one on voters, The Latino Gender Gap in US Politics. Thank you both for being here with us today. From your brief bios, we have a sense of your academic work. So I'd like to start with both of you telling us what brings you to this work so we have a better understanding of your positionality and connection to what you do. Dr. Bejarano, let's begin with you.
Okay, hello everybody. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this panel. And in terms of what brought me to my work as a graduate student, I was interested in studying the growing success of women of color in US politics. However, most of the research at the time didn't provide many explanations for what could have explained their success and was it going to continue. So I was interested in an intersectional approach to study women of color experiences in politics. So my research on Latina electoral politics is directed by a goal to incorporate the diverse viewpoints and life experiences of both women and racial and ethnic minorities into mainstream research on US politics. And this is especially coming from the important advantages that women of color can have from their multiple identities. And so, just like you mentioned in my bio, I also share my research nationally, especially the 2 books that provide leadership and training initiatives for women of color political candidates. So I also like to participate in this type of community engagement that can bridge my scholarship with the larger community, especially on behalf of diversity issues and social justice.
Thank you. Dr. Castle?
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm really pleased to be here and thinking about putting myself and giving you some context. I think one thing that's important, I know we're in a virtual world, so technically where we're rooted and the land we're on is could be a lot of different places for many of you. But I actually grew up about an hour from Columbus in Mansfield, Ohio, which is where I'm talking to you from today. And I'm visibly a white woman with my roots and my ancestors are Native and Black. I have an ancestor who's Shawnee, who, as I learned more of her story, had a big impact on understanding just the importance of oral history and traditions and how they were passed on in my own family. So I'm at a space where I'm trained as an academic, but I've been outside, I've been in the field, if you will, working around doing community accountable Indigenous research methodology, a lot of things that I have no doubt that many of us share in the commitment we have to communities, and is just really important for me to both recognize and own I'm in a space that is a sort of a hyphenate space, like a lot of us, but I am wanting to share with you what I know and my experiences based on sort of a responsibility that I have from the work that I've done, primarily focused in globally in Indigenous women's activism and leadership. So, you know, there's so much to talk about right now, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully all of us weighing in, because so far everything I've heard has really blown my mind, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that from both of you. And I think it's really important that we know that it's okay to center ourselves and our identity in our work. I learned that early on from reading Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought, as kind of a counter narrative to the way that we are generally taught as academics, that we have to separate ourselves so we can have this very objective perspective. But I think that when women of color are engaging in research that is central to their communities and the future of their communities, it's okay for us to recognize and acknowledge our own intersectionality in producing the work and engaging in the activism that is going to advance our communities. Dr. Bejarano, I'd like to begin with this next question for you. Actually, let me start with another question. I'm sorry, for Dr. Castle. The year 2020 marks 100 years of the 19th Amendment. Yet we know that even after that legislation, many women of color did not enjoy full voting and civil rights until decades later, and some still do not at the present moment. How can we make sure to tell a fuller story of women's rights, one that includes women of color? And would you both also share an example of a contribution women of color have made to the women's rights struggle that illuminates their important roles and why sharing these stories is necessary?
You know, yeah, this is, I really appreciate this, because I think recently, as I'm realizing the work, I've been trying to understand the work that I'm doing in the context of, you know, the sort of global apocalypse that is bringing to the forefront so much of what all of us work on already. And now other folks are like, oh, wait, maybe we need to know these histories. And so I think about it a lot as doing historical recovery. I really like that, rather than this concept. You know, right now we're arguing a lot about what words mean, literally, and whether facts are facts. And I'm doing a lot of work in the community also, both locally here in Mansfield, but in the places where my collective work is located. And that part, you know, so I'm often not talking in the academic jargon or language, and thinking about how I can make things accessible, and trying to bring it back now to use my fancy words. But the whole framework, I mean, I think this is the single most important thing I usually start whenever I'm trying to get people to understand an Indigenous worldview, is the simple fact that, you know, we have this relationship with what we now call Indigenous or indigeneity in what's now the United States, for example, that is entirely based on like an ideological theft. And only now are we starting to see that and talk more openly about the fact that, for example, the Constitution and some of the democratic values that people assume are the bedrock of the country is actually taken directly from, you know, the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. And the Haudenosaunee are the name for what sometimes people refer to as the Iroquois Confederacy, broken down into 5, now 6 different tribes or nations. And here's what I think is the best part of it, if you will, is it just tells us so much about the project that is America, is that though it was framed after this Haudenosaunee practice, the thing that was so strategically left out is the most critical part of what makes the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace and the structures work, is the power of the matriarchs and the power of the clan mothers. So it wasn't just, you can see people like, oh, we're going to take this, we'll use that, that's good for the country. Let's not include the fact that that the clan mothers and the women or the matriarchs in the nation hold the power to a point, hold the power to, I used to tell the story of just, you're in the longhouse or you're listening to a scenario where, literally a leader might be holding forth or speaking, and you hear the pounding of the staff, and basically grandma says, sit down, and someone new is going to be stepping into that place or that role. And so the layers that we have to unpack to get near the historical truths that are very liberating and important to know mean that as we come up to this recognition of the 19th Amendment, we're always going to find Indigenous and women of color at the heart of the story. So, and as the leaders of the protagonists of the story. So it's the same experience we have with the 19th Amendment as we understand Black women's leadership, critical leadership, and Gertrude Simmons, Zitkala Shah, Yankton, Lakota woman, Dakota woman who was a critical actor in the suffrage movement. And that's just a tiny shred of a story that shows, I guess, I feel that, storytelling and oral tradition is very important. And feel free to add in there, Dr. Bejarano. Help me out.
Okay, and I will add in there. So I want to provide a little bit of more context. And we're going to get to how women of color are especially important for helping bring more voters, especially from minority communities. So first off, we talked about the 19th Amendment, but there was also, we didn't have, just like the moderator mentioned, we didn't have the ability for all women, especially women of color, to enjoy full voting and civil rights until decades later. So we still had to wait for efforts to invalidate additional restrictions on the vote for racial and ethnic minorities. And we started to get this with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which helped Black women, especially in terms of things like we had to fight literacy tests, property requirements, poll taxes. And then in 1975, we had extensions that broadened the coverage of the act to protect more racial and ethnic minorities, which included language protections, which helped Latinas and Asian women. And we know we still have a ways to go. So in 2013, we had the Shelby Supreme Court decision, which weakened the VRA protections, and we're witnessing the results of that right now. We're seeing challenges with voter suppression. And before I get to that, there's also formerly incarcerated women who can't vote in many states. So we have to also keep that in mind. And in terms of voter suppression, we have issues with registration, early voting, which we're witnessing right now, early voting restrictions, long lines, especially long lines in racial and ethnic minority communities. And then we have voter identification laws that we're still having to worry about. And minority voters are disproportionately impacted by voter identification laws because they lack the required identification. And then, just like we're talking about today, focusing on intersectionality, there's intersectional considerations in that women who are young, low income, elderly, disabled, women of color, transgender are also most impacted by voter ID laws. So thinking about all of these restrictions, and just as we're noticing more diversity throughout the country, we're also noticing more impacts of voter suppression. And yet at the same time, we're going to talk about this in the next couple of questions, is that women of color are still turning out in wide numbers to vote. And they're also the driving forces. So I don't have a specific example, but they're also driving forces in terms of bringing not just themselves out to vote, but their families and their communities. And we'll talk about that important role next.
Thank you both for kind of giving us a broad overview from the very beginnings of this country's founding to up where we are in contemporary society. And one of the things you said, Dr. Castle, that I really liked was you said that it's liberatory to know, right? And so we're thinking about women's actions and the way that they have advanced the freedom struggle, but also the knowledge itself is empowering. And then back to something Dr. Bejarano said earlier about the importance of intersectionality. And oftentimes we think about it as really a way to better understand women's and other people's oppression, but also we need to understand it as a force for those individuals being better positioned to dismantle the structures of oppression that are impacting us. So I just want to shift a little bit, and Dr. Bejarano, I'd like to begin with you for this question. While we often use the phrase women of color, we recognize that within this broad categorization, women face varying oppressions and have unique experiences. In your view, what are the most substantial inequities facing Indigenous women, Latinas, Black women, Asian American women, and immigrant women? And feel free to address any or all of those groups of women.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'm a piggyback a little bit on the panel that was earlier. So talking about the health impacts and health policy, especially in our COVID pandemic situation. So we're witnessing that there's a disproportionate impact of COVID on women of color, especially that reflects existing societal inequalities. And so women are maybe hardest hit by the pandemic, but especially for women of color. So we're thinking about them in terms of them representing the majority of essential workers. Women of color are also overrepresented in industries with the biggest job losses, including childcare and hospitality. And in Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities, they also tend to have higher rates of pre-existing conditions. And this is associated with an increased risk for COVID and lower rates of health insurance. And we're witnessing that across the women of color groups, but also within each one of them, we're noticing even stronger risk. Like, for example, Latinos have some of the highest unemployment rates. And we're thinking about women of color, the increased likelihood to potentially live in poverty, so increased risk for food insecurity. And then bringing this back to how this is also going to create more impacts right now during our election. So in terms of voting. So NALEO provided a report talking about barriers to voter turnout to keep in mind. So Latinos in particular are more likely, just like I mentioned, because they're suffering from severe health and economic consequences. We can think about how that's also impacting their access to the polls and access to information. So there's less access to voter registration locations. So just like I was talking about with voter suppression, we're witnessing that some places that would usually be open, like the DMV, has been closed earlier or has reduced hours. So there's less chances to be able to register to vote. And then there's also restrictions and obstacles available in terms of our voting options. So early voting time has been decreased in some places. Some locations for early voting has been decreased, especially in neighborhoods of racial and ethnic minority communities. We're witnessing that there's less polling locations. And as a result, there's longer lines. So we can think about it in terms of where you live. If you're living in a more diverse area, you're likely going to have to wait longer to go and vote versus if you're living in a majority white neighborhood. And then there's also concerns about the trustworthiness of election systems and misinformation that's also could be impacting our willingness to vote, and in terms of even getting access to figure out what information is available, what's going on in the election, and how can I vote, not just vote safely, but how could I also vote with an informed decision. And I'll stop there.
Sorry, I'm madly taking notes. I mean, I think this works really well together because I'm in a space, I come from, I'm trained as a historian, and, a lot of what, when I mentioned historical recovery for contemporary change, very much like the circularity of things, like we cannot undo a lot of things in a way that's going to be helpful to us if we don't have a sense of the historical origins. And so it's very much history being alive in ways that dominant society doesn't like to think about, right? Because we literally don't, we're a country, without a past in so many ways. And it couldn't be more, to me, I've worked on it all my life, and now it's just like, interesting to see these things more part of the public discussion and the public narrative, and what can we do about it. In this, of the many answers to this question, one of the things that really I wanted to give sort of somewhat of a historical answer, in that I work with in a collective with a group called the Warrior Women Project. And it involves Native activist leaders, mostly from the 1970s. So this first wave of history that we still haven't fully unpacked in the Red Power movement, especially around the group Women of All Red Nations, which formed in 1978. And it's formed, and the women often describe it as having been an arm of the American Indian movement at the time. And because we've worked together collaboratively for years, and I bring the nuggets from the academy to say, well, this was written, what do you think? Like, does this make sense? Is this a theory that you can use that's actionable? Because the grandmothers, they are a grandmother's group, Wasagia Naji, which means grandmother standing strong. And so we've had a lot of discussions. And so WARN was formed by a handful of women. And one of the main aspects of what they worked on was to stop the illegal sterilization that now is shared more widely, and is an experience that's happened across groups of marginalized groups or women of color. But with the Native women and the Indian Health Service, which is a federally funded treaty exchange of rights and protections, it was tracked so openly and statistically that it was very bold. Like, we are actively sterilizing women, and you can track it and trace it. And so already putting that into the contemporary context, where the articles and the information's coming out that this genocide is being practiced at the border that's imposed on, the freedom of Indigenous people to move between nations. And so at that theoretical level, that circle and that cycle is ongoing. And, we also see that tied to, going back historically, missing and murdered Indigenous women has become a hashtag that has seen a lot of, certainly compared to the past, it's seen a lot of traction, and it is an umbrella that covers so many different things. But part of what it does tie to in such an important way is this fundamental understanding that you have to, in order to access land and the power that comes with that, you have to remove and occupy really the bodies of Indigenous women. And that is so deeply interconnected. So I know I'm speaking on this sort of like theoretical world view framework, but you can see it in all of these very practical applications. And so, right now there's a Native American Voting Rights Act that has been introduced right now, all tied to these issues of, all the structural things that stand in the way, like not having a physical address on a reservation, and then all the other material aspects of voter suppression that are so active in the country. And that, is just a drop in the bucket of all the issues. But I think what's powerful now is the way in which, just the way in which we see so much more political leadership right now than we have seen in the past in terms of formal political leadership for Native women. There's even more folks running now, more women running than there was in 2018, 2016. And it's a bit of a takeover in some areas. And I'm going to share some of that in the social media, but it's a powerful thing we see now. I'm going to calm down.
And I would just add into that, thinking specifically about Black women, issues around maternal mortality rates and very high infant mortality rates. And really in this political climate, just access to family planning and abortion care and all sorts of reproductive justice issues. But the interesting thing is that even when we attempt to separate out and think about the uniqueness of various women's experiences, that we still see a lot of similarities among women of color and immigrant women, which kind of leads to, an issue of linked fate, right? And the connectedness among women of color and why that category remains useful as both an identity status as well as a political mobilization tool. So Dr. Castle, back to you. As we look to the future, what policies and practices should we prioritize to help reduce the inequities that we've just discussed?
Thank you for adding that, Dr. Morris. I was going to say, please jump in and support as part of this conversation, because there's just, I always feel the pressure of, the challenge of intersectionality is also the inability to simultaneously use all the words needed at the same time. But I want to answer this question again a little bit theoretical leading to the practical. And I know, like, we've spent so much time, and it's very true, around problematizing, unpacking, tearing down, and rebuilding the construct of feminism as a word, as a concept and an idea. One of the things that that's what the Warrior Women Project is dedicated to, and a lot of the community-based work that's rooted in scholarship, that's liberatory scholarship, is the need to find better terminology and better reference points to imbue, to follow women of color and Indigenous women, to whether we call it BIPOC, leadership, and just the fundamental, just when we use women, it still it is always referential to white. So, and I know that, this is something, it's just exhausting, because we need to start from the place, like, we're only going to see the success and the change in all of these elements if we can make that linked fate centered on women of color's leadership, unpacking what leadership means in these different contexts. Is there a better word we can use? Because that's very much, these are all the words that, activist, leadership, women, feminist, that are words that we're still trying to stretch over the Indigenous experience, if you will. And so I just think, that's one of the main places where we end up starting and having to unpack that itself. And so if we can do more active work about recentering and maybe collectively finding better terminology and being willing to put it in the center, so that we're not always in the comparative space outside of that. And I know that's a very general thing, but it's just one of the elements that I think of, because right now there's a group of 9 women in Mansfield, Ohio, who have brought forth a task force on declaring racism as a public health issue and a public health emergency. And it grows from a group that we started not long ago that is entirely about women of color leadership, that is a shared space between white women and women of color. And it's just very fascinating, on the very grassroots level, in a very, very non-progressive space as Mansfield, of how you actually make these things work in making change, so that we can work on, maternal mortality, infant mortality and maternal issues, and all of those other things that we see as a result. So I'm trying to put it all together, like, from theory in the classroom all the way to the space of, politics in the community. So that's what I'm thinking there.
Okay, and I will follow up by talking especially about what we can do to prioritize or reduce these inequities. And in terms of where I'm coming from as a political scientist, I think it's important that we get more people out to vote, especially across minority communities. So in terms of being able to vote and understand the issues that are at stake, especially these inequities that we've been discussing, and then also vote for people that are going to represent these communities and especially support policies that would help them and try to prioritize these inequities. So how we can do this, I focus on women of color as voters and as candidates and elected officials. So one way, we also have to need to address the voter suppression. So I've been talking about voter suppression, and it's especially impacting minority communities. But at the same time, what's interesting is that these minority communities, as we can see, the voting rates are increasing. And so they're doing this in the midst or in spite of these voter suppression efforts, which are exciting to witness, but still kind of frustrating because you could imagine what their voting rates would look like if we didn't have the voter suppression efforts. But I want to focus especially on Black women and Latinas, who are two of the largest and fastest growing populations of women of color voters. And at the same time, they're also, we have to think about voting and supporting more women of color and allied candidates, which can have policy implications. So some policies that are important is the fight for equal pay. So compared to white men, women of color make even less. And especially when you think about equal pay days, the Latina Day is the last in the year where the Latinas finally catch up to what white men are getting paid. So the Latina Equal Pay Day is coming up on October 29th, but compare that to Asian women, which is in February, white women's in April, Black women's in August, and Native American women is October the 1st. So we have to think about voting to get elected officials to office that will pass more legislation to fight for equal pay. And then also thinking about issues of importance that are impacting these minority communities. We've mentioned several of them, but in terms of the Latino community, recent polls show that they don't just care about immigration policy. So that's also important to keep in mind, is we assume that minority communities are only going to care about maybe one issue, one or two issues. But just like we mentioned in terms of linked fate, or the idea that we're sort of all having similar struggles and obstacles, we can think about various issues that are important to minority communities. So for Latinos, the number one is responding to coronavirus, and lowering costs of healthcare is the next. Then dealing with unemployment, creating more jobs, improving wages, protecting immigrant rights, and stopping discrimination against immigrants and Latinos. And then the next one, which again is going to be important to everybody, is criminal justice and police reform. So thinking about all these issues of importance and trying to focus on what we can do to get more voters and get more elected officials that can support these policies that are important to these communities.
So I think that you all are doing an amazing job of providing a really balanced and comprehensive discussion of the issues. And I really appreciate that, because I think that these are all issues that need to be addressed from a variety of viewpoints, right? And so when we think about, as Dr. Castle mentioned a few minutes ago, redefining terms, and some people think, well, that's, superfluous given the issues that are going on. But I think that that is a central issue, particularly if we're thinking about cultures that center the oral tradition of storytelling, and just the importance of being able to name yourself in a society in which that dehumanization process included an attempt to strip people from their culture and their names. And so that makes me think very specifically about redefining leadership and why that's so important for women. And that we need to expand this concept of leadership beyond the formal structures of what is typically defined in a masculine way as leadership. And so if we think about what Dr. Bejarano was saying with regard to getting people to the polls, right? If we have women in those communities who are organizing voter registration drives or carpools to get people to the polls, that we need to recognize that as a valuable form of leadership that is going to advance the ultimate goal of increasing voter representation among women of color. So just to think about, again, that the formal structures first, and then we'll get again to some of the grassroots activism. Why are women of color so underrepresented in electoral politics and in policy making? And what are the benefits of having more women of color in policy making positions? And how can we bring more women of color into these positions? We'll start with Dr. Bejarano for this one.
Okay. So I want to pick up a little bit more on the diversity of our voters. So with the 2016 presidential election, it was the most diverse electorate in US history, and we could just imagine that 2020 might be even more diverse than we witnessed in 2016. And turnout is also looking to be higher than we had in previous elections as well. And the majority of this growing electorate is made up of young voters, unmarried women, and racial and ethnic minority populations. So this is known as the rising American electorate. And these voters are also more non-traditional voters, so they're less likely to have the strong party ties, which is also one reason why they're not as invested in the parties and as invested in the candidates that get put up in each election. So that can also explain why our numbers are increasing, but our numbers could be increasing even at higher rates if they felt more of the connection to the parties and to the electoral system. And with that, we're also witnessing that the voters that, especially for Latinos, they also have the most first time and new voters. So they're not just new voters to the electoral system, but they're also because they are just of age. So Latinos have a much younger population. So these are new voters that have to think about who do I vote for, especially if I don't feel a strong tie to a political party. And so we have to think about how do we have successful outreach attempts to these minority communities, especially if we keep in mind these are new voters, these are non-traditional voters, these are ones without strong ties to political parties, but these are communities that care about various important issues of the day. So what can we do to reach out to them in a culturally sensitive way, but also reach out to them for a longer amount of time? So have investment in these communities and not just start reaching out to them right before a presidential election, for example. And a little bit more about that in terms of this growing electorate. This growing electorate is also important in terms of women of color. So that's what I study. And in terms of, you might have heard the gender gap. So there are also gender differences in terms of women turning out to vote at higher rates than men. And it includes women of color. And as they're turning out to vote in higher rates, they're also showing a gender gap in terms of their support for Democratic candidates. So women of color are also reinforcing this idea of the gender gap where they are supporting more Democratic candidates, more liberal public policies. So because of that, we are now also witnessing emerging efforts to mobilize these women of color and as voters, and then also recruit them as candidates. And briefly mention, I know Dr. Castle mentioned the growing number of candidates, but in this election in 2020, we have a record number of women candidates, for example, to the US House. There's 583 women candidates to the US House. That's a record that increased from just the last time we set a record in 2018. And there's also a record number of women of color running for Congress. And women of color are a larger percentage of all women running for US House. So I know the numbers are still low, they're still underrepresented in terms of all candidates and in terms of all elected officials, but we still see some signs that look positive, hopefully in the future, especially if we're seeing that women of color are such a large percentage of all women that are deciding to run for the US House, and such a large percentage of voters that are turning out to the election.
I just like listening to you. That's numbers and statistics, because you know, I think I realize at the moment I'm coming from a space where it's interesting because I'm working, we call, you know, the OGGs, these original gangster grannies, who were folks who took up arms against the government, you know, in defense of communities like Wounded Knee and but they also, and I guess this is the part I'm just sort of tracing out is, you know, I mean, women of color are underrepresented in the most fundamental way that we understand, considering how openly charged and exposed the white supremacist foundations of this country are actively functioning out there, but we still don't name it as much as we need to. So very clearly, whether it's, Anna Julia Cooper or Fannie Lou Hamer, just because I always think of her power and her rhetoric and, just the simple fact that it's like, she was so powerful, they had to shut down the network television, they had to take her off the air because of what she represented in terms of who gets taken care of when women of color lead. And, and my point here is that a lot of these original Gangster Granny folk that people assume that they're like, oh, we don't believe in the system, or they're not interested, but they're totally focused on electoral politics now. Even defined as, radical activists in the movement days, because that is where the power is. And so the benefit already just we see, for example, in like a case study of, Ruth Buffalo, who is a representative in North Dakota, who has her own radio show, Native Roots Radio, Truth with Ruth. And on this radio show that happens every week, this is an immediate access point for Native women and Native folks running for office. So it's a wonderful place for you to interact with them at any given time, week to week, through Native Roots Radio. And what we see is the number of folks who are now elected to office, and these are primarily Native women who are working on issues of water protection, which go back to pipelines. And in these pipelines, bringing in the protection that comes with not only protecting water and other economic systems that are in place to do that, but also the fact that it is a way in which you then can disrupt the man camps that are being established during COVID, which are, temporary housing units where folks are brought in to work on the pipelines, because none of this, like as COVID shuts down in so many other ways, it's the perfect guise for these projects to continue. That's happening across Indian country. So just the power of who is protected when women and women of color are taking care of their families as a political priority is I think the incredible power of sort of going from the local to the global and back again. And I'm particularly interested in being able to talk a little bit more about the grassroots elements of it, but we're just seeing we're seeing these folks, break down the master's house using the master's tools, and with the number of folks running now, we're hoping for a revolution. So, that's what I think, at least it's happening in Indian country, where you see women who normally would not be running for office in any way, shape, or form, simply doing what has to be done. For sure.
Thank you. So we have about 7 minutes left. So I just want to shift to some questions from the audience. And just a reminder, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. Because you both talk a little more about connecting local communities and local leaders with formal policy-making channels like elections, local governments, local political party structures, et cetera.
Okay, I'll start. So I didn't get a chance to mention this yet, but there's also where we're talking about connections, especially the important influence of women of color in local communities. And I want to mention a research project that I'm doing with a fellow Buckeye, so Dr. Wendy Smoot. And we're documenting the important work of women of color that they're doing, not just in the local communities, but nationwide, and how they are working to move women of color as reliable voters and important voters, like I mentioned, to candidates for public office, and finding a way to be connected with the political system. So women of color organizations and coalitions that are throughout the country are organizing to increase voter engagement and political recruitment. And so they've been doing this important work for so long, but we haven't necessarily talking about Dr. Kessel documenting the important work of these women of color. I'm also doing that in terms of their political work. So they've done so much, and we need to learn from them and to learn what could possibly happen from their efforts looking to the future. And I think we also had some steps about what everybody else can do, but I'll wait on that.
Actually, if it's okay, I'm going to shake it up for a second. I mean, that's the thing I really wanted to ask you all. Right now in this moment with what, 12 days? I can't remember right now, 12 or 13 days till the election. You know, I'm thinking about just like what can be done in Mansfield and what can be done in your community, but what do you think, what's the quickest way that we can plug into supporting women of color led initiatives or efforts? Even like, I mean, maybe Dr. Smooth will be able to give us some specific names, but so that we can literally get off the, you know, event today and plug into that. What do you have a path for that or some specific ideas? Christina, Dr. Bejarano.
So there are several nationwide initiatives. So we've got, for African-American women, there's Higher Heights. And if you look through their information, they are providing a lot of information about how the communities can get involved in the vote and especially support African-American women candidates. And then we have a new initiative that started just recently called She Se Puede. So how Latinas can get involved. And this has been throughout the week. So you can look online, and they've been doing some live videos, and it's been available on Facebook Live, for example. So they are going and talking about not just how Latinas can get involved in politics, but what's important to them in terms of health, business, money, and at the local level, at the national level. And those are the two that come to mind just right now, but there are many. That's why Dr. Smooth and I are trying to document all of them. I'll put a couple more in the box. But with these, I guess we could look at the silver lining, or at least try to, with what this pandemic is bringing us, is that we have more opportunities to at least virtually engage with some of these groups and these efforts. So for example, we might not have the opportunity to go and travel to where they're going to have talks for some of these groups. We might not be able to go out, especially if we have some physical limitations. We might not be able to go and protest to try to promote social justice and social justice change, but we could look to a virtual type of engagement. And so this is where I can connect with you all from Texas in my home office and be able to talk about these important issues and see how we have similar experiences and similar interests across all the way in Ohio.
Oh, sorry, I was unmuted that whole time. You probably hear me going, I'm typing, because I was looking up I mean, obviously, you know, Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, and I threw in the chat, and Dr. Smooth is putting stuff in the chat too. And there is something in there that is a list of the social media of all of the current Indigenous activist groups that are taking actions right now. But, you know, and She Could Be Next is a really powerful 2-part documentary series. I'm really big into how much documentaries can affect people. And there's just a number of really powerful ones out right now. Yeah, so I'm just really interested in, because I was just thinking last night, I'm in a community that's deeply, deeply not progressive. And it's very hard to, you know, to figure out how to take action in a moment where that physicality isn't possible. In some ways it might be good, just because of the number of open carry AR-15 folks down the street. But in the process, like, I want to do something right now. And I want to give other people that immediate access point. So all this is really helpful.
Another one is Reflect Us. It's a nonpartisan coalition, and it brings several groups together and trying to increase the number of women in office, achieve equal representation. And a lot of these groups, it's kind of hard to keep track of all of them, but it's hard to keep track of it in a good way too, especially all of the efforts that they're trying to do right now during the election. So a lot of them are doing virtual sessions, just like we were doing today, bringing important speakers, bringing issues to the forefront. And so especially just try to keep your eye on how you can get involved with them. And then also find any way to get involved in issues that are important to you. Volunteer for a community organization, volunteer for a political campaign, support a civil rights organization. And then also especially think about how your identity, and this is why it's important thinking about Linked Fate and women of color, think about how your identity, your personal experiences and perspective can provide a much needed and unique viewpoint. So we all have strengths, and they may have been overlooked as strengths because they're not considered traditional, but you can think of what you bring to the table. And I like to point out that your unique identity and life experiences provide those strengths that are needed and definitely need to come to the political table, especially.
Well, thank you both. We are unfortunately out of time. I would love to continue this discussion. Thank you again for this insightful and stimulating conversation. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. And we hope to see you back at 12 p.m. Eastern for the next session after this short break.